Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the IBAC SafetyNet Webinar series. Today's session is presented by Polaris Aero, discussing recognizing and reducing risk in business aviation and flight and maintenance crews. My name is Catherine Hilst, and I am the IBAC Operations Manager and your host for today. I do have a few housekeeping items for you. Just so you know, everybody attending is on mute, and you'll stay on mute for the presentation. However, you do have a place to submit questions or comments. It's a questions box. Just click on that box and type in your questions or comments as they come up, and we will look at those during the Q&A session after the presentation. We're very excited to welcome back Polaris Aero. This presentation will address the importance of conducting risk assessments in business aviation prior to flying, performing maintenance, or servicing aircraft. Traditional risk assessment processes depend on workers' perceptions of risks. Since perceptions are shaped by experience, a lack of relevant experience can result in a misperception of risk. Simply giving a worker access to more information isn't enough, as the information can be overwhelming. It's also unrealistic to expect workers to know or remember all the rules, procedures, regulations, manuals, reports, brochures, bulletins, etc. applicable to their flight or job. Given the unforgiving nature of aviation, forgetting a critical piece of information can have catastrophic consequences. So this webinar is going to demonstrate how technology can be used to find the most relevant information for a pilot's flight or a maintenance technician's activities and put into context the meaningful information that can keep them as safe as possible. Our presenters today, Madeline Young and Sean Ronenberg. Madeline is the product manager for Polaris Aero and is responsible for developing the VOCUS product roadmap and ensuring the roadmap is aligned with customer needs, regulatory requirements, and the Polaris Aero vision. Madeline has served as both a safety and compliance specialist for private and governmental entities and holds a master's in advanced safety engineering. And Sean is the client onboarding specialist at Polaris Aero. He specializes in technical support and training as it relates to safety processes and the use of VOCUS technology. He works with flight departments and other aviation stakeholders to turn their SMS into practical action on a daily basis. Before joining Polaris Aero, Sean worked as a product manager with an international flight planning provider, overseeing the implementation of flight planning and safety-related software solutions. Madeline, Sean, welcome. I'm very excited to have you guys back, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. Always a pleasure to be back here. So just to double back on the briefing that you gave of what we're going to be talking about today, I think it's important to recognize that risk and risk management plays out in so many different ways in our operations, be it flight or maintenance and ground. And by the way, I'll preface the conversation with, if we say maintenance or ground, we're really talking in general about operations on the ground versus operations in the air, and we'll be talking about both of those in general here. So I just want to put that forward, that wherever you hear those words, we're just kind of using them interchangeably just for today's discussion in terms of your approach to managing risk. But back to my previous point is that, you know, risk is going to play out in a lot of different ways, right? And we'll get into a definition and what ICAO says about that, and the ISBAO and the ISBA as well. But what our focus is today is our pre-work risk assessment. So in general, what you'll see as a theme here is a couple of things. First is that you'll see this general theme that just because we've always done something a certain way doesn't mean that we can't change it. It doesn't mean that that's the only way. It doesn't mean that that's the right way. You know, we can use these very emotionally driven terms around just doing things, and particularly when it comes to pre-flight or pre-work risk assessments. And so I just want to put that bug in your ear and just watch for that theme, because that should start to resonate with you, hopefully with some examples and some, you know, different topics that we're going to get into. And then the second kind of idea or theme here is that we can't really rely on our own cognition to help us remember everything, to help us even pull in all of our own experience at any given time, right? There is, especially in this age now of big data, where it's very common to see information pushed to us because more information is better than not having information, right? And that now we're getting into information overload, and now it's a matter of, okay, now that we have all of this information driven from this big data that we're accumulating, what are we really meant to do with that, and how can we utilize it in the best way where it's assisting the gaps in our own cognitive limitations. And so we'll get into some of that as well. Now, before I get into the agenda of what we're going to talk through, I'm going to ask a question that's a rhetorical question that I just want you to think about and remember, because you'll see it come up again at the very end. And that question is, does 1 + 1 = 2? I'm just going to leave it there. And let's just briefly run through the agenda here. So I am going to start by defining where we're at with, I say regulatory framework, I'm really talking about the international standards and also civil regulatory framework and definitions around risk in general, just to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. There are many different definitions out there. We all can, think about it in different ways and apply it in different ways. The only reason I'm bringing up the definitions is to make sure that in this conversation, we know what we're talking about. So anything outside of those definitions, right, might warrant a different conversation. So keep that in mind. Then we're going to move on to the traditional risk assessment tools and what some pitfalls are with that modern approach. And so when I talk about traditional risk assessment, think of the numerical FRAT, if you're a pilot, right, that you would tally up a score associated with hazards that you might be encountering and get a number and make a decision based on that number. We're seeing that same thing utilized on the ground operations side as well, maybe not as ubiquitously, but it's still there. And so when we talk about traditional FRAT, that's what we're talking about. And again, with that term FRAT, I'm referring to both maintenance flight risk assessment as well as and ground as well as flight risk assessment. The term is very easy to just kind of slip in there. So FRAT more holistically is our approach to that. And then we'll get into our more modern approach to risk assessment. So how can we kind of combat these pitfalls that we know exist? How can we challenge pre-existing norms of how you go about doing a risk assessment and modernize that to meet what we know now about the culture that we're in? And by culture, I'm not referring to safety culture. I'm referring to just in general as a society. Where were we 20 years ago, 30 years ago when we first introduced flight risk assessment tools? And where are we now? There should be an evolution. And our modern approach, we believe, is part of that evolution. And then we'll show just a couple of examples, both ground and flight, of what we would hope to see in a modern flight risk assessment. And then, of course, we'll end with Q&A. So that being said, let's go ahead and get into the regulatory framework. And where I always start is with ICAO Annex 19. And I always start here because I often find in these conversations that I have, even with our own customers, is that there's this lack of awareness of what Annex 19 even is and how it can benefit you by reading it. It is publicly available, so if you just Google it, you'll find resources or links to take you there. There's an online, it's like ICAO, if you will look for that reference, and that's the one that I in particular use, and it's always kept up to date. So ICAO Annex 19 basically consolidates all SMS standards and recommended practices from that used to exist in all of the varying annexes. So it was kind of all over the place, and then they consolidated that back in 2013. And really what it is meant to do is outline the requirements, if you will, for state safety programs. State obviously referring to member states of the EU and under ICAO. So for example, the United States FAA, right? That's who we're referring to. The Civil Aviation Authority for any nation that falls under that umbrella would reference ICAO Annex 19 for what they should be doing within their state. There are two components to that. There's what should, for example, the FAA be doing to manage safety at the FAA level, and what should the FAA be doing to disseminate standards, safety management standards, to any service provider under their umbrella. So that would be any, for example, Part 91, 135, 121, right? Any of those federal parts would fall under that umbrella. So Chapter 3 is what outlines the state safety programs. It provides that clear framework for implementing and overseeing the SSP to ensure that the states maintain kind of a more structured approach to managing safety at the national level. Chapter 4 is what actually outlines the SMS requirements for the service providers. So, and again, I understand the word requirements comes with heavy weight. This is again under ICAO, right? So they're not mandating anything. This is standards or recommended practices that they're disseminating. So anyways, Chapter 4 outlines those SMS requirements that are meant to be overseen by the nation's civil aviation authorities. So again, domestically for me, that would be the FAA. And Chapter 4 specifically states that the SMS service provider shall establish an SMS that is in accordance with the framework of Appendix 2 of Annex 19. I'll show that in just a minute, and be commensurate with the size of the service provider and the complexity of its aviation products and services. Those are very critical points. It's saying use the framework that we have, which isn't very complicated or long, and you'll see that in a minute, and make sure that it's just scoped to the size and complexity of your organization. As long as you do A and can justify B, you're on the right path. And this goes for maintenance and ground operations as well. Just because you're not explicitly required by your Civil Aviation Authority, for example, to have an SMS, does not mean that you can't utilize the standards that have already been set. So that's what we're grounding our conversation in today. So if we look at Appendix 2 of Annex 19, you'll find the actual framework there. And I have a little arrow pointing to where our conversation is today, which is under safety risk management and safety risk assessment and mitigation. So this is what you're seeing here. If you've heard of the term, the 4 pillars of SMS, which I'm sure you have at this point, and the 12 elements, that's what we're looking at here, but it's been reframed into the 4 components and the 12 elements. And that's because from what I understand, ICAO is really making a concerted effort to emphasize that SMS, these components don't exist in their own little silos. And that's what that pillars reference was kind of representing or being misinterpreted as. So that's been done away with, and we've moved on to the idea of components. And these components are intended to be interwoven in your entire operation. I'll only say this once because it's not really what our conversation is today, but SMS is really just about doing business better. We're all in the business of doing something, right? Of making money, or maybe we're a nonprofit, but we're still providing a service, for example. And so we understand that. But in our everyday doings, we're already creating safety just by having certain protocols and policies and procedures and training and considerations in place. So really where SMS comes into play is codifying that and making sure that it's kind of reaching the depths of your organization and not just being kind of siloed. And it's manual that's on a shelf that you pull out every 3 years for your ISBAO audit, for example. So that being said, what I actually want to look at, what we care about today, is that section, component 2, safety risk management. What does it say? If you have never looked at the Annex 19 Appendix 2, I highly encourage you do, because it is short. It's like 2.5 pages long, basically a description of all of these things, maybe 1 or 2 sentences per thing. So it's not very long, it's not very complicated. Actually, it's quite simple. And this is all they say on safety risk management. This is it, okay? So it says, and I'm going to read off the slide here, that the service provider shall develop and maintain a process to identify hazards associated with its products or services, and hazard identification shall be based on a combination of reactive and proactive methods. Okay, so that's part 1 on hazard identification. That is a significant component of what we're talking about today. And then part 2 is that the service provider shall develop and maintain a process that ensures analysis, assessment, and control of safety risks identified with those hazards. That's all that's required. So there's a lot of flexibility there. Now, if that's not enough for you to go on, hopefully today's conversation helps, but also know, and if you're in this conversation, you probably are already aware that ICAO does have supporting safety management manual, Doc 9859, that you can reference, that goes into a little bit more depth. It is still largely flight operations focused, but you can still interpret it for ground operations as well. And then of course the ISBAO and the ISBA have guidance material that supports those as well. So if you haven't read the guidance materials out there, of course I'm going to encourage you to do that. Now, I want to actually talk about implementing SMS briefly because it's important to understand why we're doing it. If you're in this conversation, you either already have an SMS and you're maybe just trying to understand something a little bit better or fine tune your operation, or perhaps you don't have a formal SMS. And in this case, you're starting to dip your toes into implementing a piece of that. And the question that we want to ask ourselves is why? Why SMS? And the second question we want to ask is, which standard should we adhere to? Now, of course, you have regulations, and we'll get to that in just a minute, but what standard do you adhere to? So if you don't have much experience in this line of work, I think that these questions can be a little bit daunting. So I'm going to ask a few more, I guess, hypothetical questions here. For example, why don't all regulations inherently include SMS practices? Is that question even a true question? Maybe they do. What would SMS provide that we as a service provider don't already have? And let's say you're a small organization and your safety record's great, or you're a big organization and your safety record's great. When and where would you see a return on investment in spending the time to implement SMS practices? Okay, those are some things that you might want to think through, and everyone's going to have a different answer and a different approach to this, but it can at least kind of reveal where your priorities are in the organization and where there would be room to fit some of these best practices in. Remember that component of Annex 19 where it said to implement SMS in a way that is appropriate with your size and complexity. If you're not ready to handle, risk management, but you are able to at least start with hazard identification, okay, start there. All right, so a few other questions, right? Where do we begin? I already asked what standard is right for me. What about things like operational health and safety? What about ISO? What about your local or national regulations? What does quality and safety have to do with each other? What about maintenance and ground, as well as flight operations, since maintenance and ground tend to be kind of the forgotten children kind of this whole thing, which is why we want to have the conversation we're having today. Do you have to be audited? Each of these questions come with their own dedicated webinars, and hopefully we'll be able to address all of them in due time. We're only going to touch on a few of them in today's discussion, but the point that I'm trying to make is that there is a lot out there that you can refer to in terms of international standards, in terms of domestic regulations. Maybe you like a different domestic regulation from maybe from EASA or from Canada or from the Australians or from China, right? There are all of these different regulations out there that are also proving to be effective in their own right. So maybe that can exist. So what is the least that you need to know to implement at least one component of SMS? The first thing that you need to know is your own requirements underneath your nation's Civil Aviation Authority. So I'll start with, in the United States, as we know, Part 135, charter operators are now required to implement SMS, and there's the mandate for that. There's a couple years still until you have to make your declaration of it. But Part 91 and maintenance repair organizations aren't under that requirement. So are you required? No, that's answering the first question. Or are you? Yes. Okay, now you have somewhere to start. And what are those requirements? What are the supplemental programs from your nation's authority? That's another interesting thing that you'll want to consider. For example, voluntary reporting programs that might exist that can help you start to create rapport with your nation's Civil Aviation Authority. What about international requirements? So there are requirements for certain aircraft operators, for example, operating at the international level, even if your own nation isn't requiring something of you. And also, what are international standards? And then something that's often forgotten, what does your own company's current documentation say? Are you familiar with it? Is it requiring you to do risk management now and you are not doing it? And does it have guidelines for you? What are those guidelines? Do they need to be modified, or is it something that you can work within? Those are some things you'd want to look at. And then finally, this understanding of regulations versus guidance. Remember that regulations tell us what to do, but not how to do it. Guidance material that accompanies a standard or regulation is typically tried and true, but it's not regulation itself. So, for example, in the United States, AC 120-92 Delta is the current SMS guidance material, and still it is largely focused on larger operators and doesn't really have much guidance for ground operations like MROs and FBOs, even though it's the pre-existing reference, because that reference is really supporting what the regulation is. So even though it's good, what you read in that is still to be taken, for example, I'll use the phrase, with a grain of salt, right? The guidance material is not regulation in and of itself. It's just meant to provide an option or a few options to go about implementation. So that being said, and I'll briefly move through this, but the next point that I want to make is that regulations and standards really only set a bar for compliance. Think of the fact that ICAO is trying to reach all of their member states. Their member states go beyond the United States, Canada, Europe, China, Australia, kind of these more sophisticated aviation cultures, right? They have to consider the lowest common denominator. What I'm trying to emphasize with that is that it's written to be just a bar to meet, not just a bar to meet, but a bar to exceed, especially for the more sophisticated environments like, for example, in the United States. So the final point here is that your organization is already creating safety. So whether or not you have documentation around it, you're already doing it. If you're going out in your daily work and considering the fact that you're a little bit tired today, and so maybe you shouldn't be working with high-powered equipment, okay, you're conducting a risk assessment. So these things are very natural in our work. They're natural in everyday life too, right? Like think about merging on a highway. You're constantly assessing, okay, where can I fit in? What are the risks? Do I need to speed up? Do I need to slow down? You're making those trade-offs in real time. And the same thing is happening just with a little bit different weight and perspective in your daily work. And so that's what we're going to tap into now. So moving on quickly through definitions, defining risk. I'm going to refer to ICAO's Safety Management Manual for a definition of risk because I think it's a pretty good one, right? They say risk management is the continuous process of identifying hazards, conducting safety risk assessments, developing and implementing safety risk mitigations, and accepting risk. So it's all of those things. Sounds very academic, sounds rigid and structured, time consuming, but it doesn't need to be that, right? Take from this definition what you will, but for today, we're talking about identifying hazards, conducting real-time risk assessments, making trade-offs, right? Implementing mitigations, and by implementing mitigations, it could be something such as making a decision to not do something because your perception of risk is too high in that moment, for example. Moving on, you can't define risk without defining hazard because that shows up in every definition of risk. And so hazard here, I've got two definitions up from Doc 9859 and from the FAA. And this is just to show, because I've showed this slide before in a previous presentation, but the FAA did update their definition of a hazard to be more aligned with ICAO's definition. So in the gist of it is that it is a condition or an object with the potential to cause or contribute to an unsafe operation of aircraft or aviation safety related equipment, products, or services, or lead to a potential incident or accident. My personal opinion, I think this definition is still a bit limiting because it puts the emphasis on preventing incidents or accidents or bad things from happening, if you will, not necessarily on increasing doing things better or increasing resilience, if you will. So I think we could still fine tune that culturally. I think that will come with time. But for today, this is the definition we're working with. And then finally, a risk assessment, another definition from the industry, is the process of analyzing and evaluating the potential for risk associated with a hazard. And so therefore, a risk assessment tool is actually identifying what those hazards are, the condition or object, and then facilitating the analysis. So the risk assessment tool is basically taking the hazard definition and the risk assessment definition and combining it together. How do we identify those hazards? And then how do we facilitate the analysis and mitigation of those in real time pre-work? So with that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at traditional risk assessment tools and pitfalls. There are five pitfalls we're going to look at. And for that, I'm going to pass it over to Sean to start.
Yeah, good morning, folks. I'm glad to be here this morning. Appreciate it, Madeline. Just to piggyback on what Madeline was mentioning, as we set the regulatory framework, we realize there's this impetus, there's this need to formally identify hazards before we do something, whether that be going to a flight or starting a maintenance activity. This is the reason we're formalized this content here. So traditionally, in the early 2000s, this idea of formalizing this risk assessment process began to be formalized by industry groups, FAA, and so forth. And now, typically, we've arrived at something like you see on the screen here. And as you go through a traditional FRAD or MRAD at this point, it identifies a set list of known hazards and associates some kind of score with it, which most of you are probably familiar with. We don't really have a concern with identifying those known hazards. This is a good thing to do. It's going to contribute to a positive safety culture. Where we have concern is with using these numerical values to assist us in taking some action. So we'll talk about some pitfalls and the numbers leading us to potentially some wrong conclusions. But we need to ask ourselves a question with whatever tool we're using, whether it's a FRAT or some other system. Is it facilitating the increasing of knowledge? And is it going to help me to take a better action and keep the flight or the operation safe? So we're going to address some of those here in just a moment. So again, hazards, let's continue to look at those. I think we're going to expand upon that. We don't want to restrict ourselves to just a set list of hazards that never really grows over time. We want to be able to evaluate a significant other issues that are out there that maybe we're not aware of yet. And so as we discover things, as we work, as we do our business, we want to incorporate those into that risk assessment process. So the first thing here, one of the first pitfalls to identify in looking at some of the traditional tools is this idea of this pre-flight perception, this subjectivity that's involved in the analysis of the hazards. So you can see here just a funny example. The kitten, the cat here, it looks in the mirror and sees a lion. It sees what it wants to see about itself. And so when we look into the mirror of a FRAT, it's subjective in nature. If we have pressure to go perform, we may see what we want to see. We may not observe a hazard as truly a significant hazard. We may continue on, not realizing that really there's an inherent risk if we continue forward. So when we look at a traditional FRAT and we use numbers and we manipulate numbers, it can lead us to false conclusions when, again, we see what we want to see. Madeline's going to discuss an accident case here in just a minute, but the next one is really talking about knowledge assumption. So I'll let Madeline describe this accident case study for a minute.
Yeah, exactly, Sean. So this, for those who aren't familiar, and maybe you are, this was an accident that occurred in November of 2004, just after Thanksgiving. So it was a Challenger 601 that crashed shortly after takeoff in Montrose. And really what, in gist, and you can read up on the accident, but I'll keep it brief here, is that there was an accumulation of icing on the wings, and there was a lack of a pre-takeoff contamination check. And essentially, obviously, we know where that leads to with aerodynamics, and the crew were not able to maintain control of the aircraft and unfortunately crashed. What came from that accident is this conversation of knowledge versus experience. Does experience equal knowledge? I think that's an interesting question to pose, because our general reaction to that is probably, yeah, knowledge or experience does equal knowledge, and you can play it probably the same way too. Knowledge equals an accumulation of experience. However, what experience did these crew members have, right? They had thousands of hours between them. a very well-educated crew. However, they lacked experience, in particular in mountainous terrain, particularly during winter operations. And so there was this assumption that was made that, you know, or this dynamic between the crew of invulnerability, right? We have all of this experience between us, and so we'll be fine. Or even from a different perspective of, you know, schedule and dispatch, right? We often, they're involved in this conversation. Then you have conversations on the ground with maintenance technicians, and, you know, you could have someone out on the line who has tugged a million aircraft, but have they tugged a Challenger 601? How is that different? And so there's this assumption that we can make that our experience directly equates to the knowledge that we need under any given circumstance, and that's not necessarily true. And so we just need to be very aware of these knowledge assumptions that we make in real time when we're assessing risk pre-work. And that'll make more sense here, I think, towards the end. Sean is going to then introduce this awareness paradox. Sean?
Yeah, so one of the other pitfalls to be aware of as we think about risk assessment is this idea of oversimplifying hazards that we see. So in this first visual here, perhaps I'm a new pilot and I'm looking at the big puffy cloud and realizing that, yeah, there's some hazard might exist there, but I'm just going to operate around it or above it and so forth. Not a big deal. Hasn't been a problem before. And so as a lower experienced person, I might look at this situation and have a plan of action, but not realize there are other risks involved behind the scenes. So I might see this as a go situation, whereas a more experienced pilot observes the same puffy cloud and realizes that there's severe turbulence involved there. There's hail, there's lightning. There are risk factors to the aircraft and safety of flight that I'm more aware of as a more experienced individual, resulting in a no-go situation. The same would hold true for, again, maintenance personnel. As we look at the hazards of the work we're about to encounter and start, we need to realize that, again, the more experienced person, generally speaking, is going to be aware of a myriad of issues that could result in some cascading effect. So this is the awareness paradox, and just something to be aware of as we go about reviewing and assessing risk prior to an operation.
Yeah, and I think the key point to this too, right, Sean, is that idea of oversimplification of hazards, right? Tunnel vision or dependency that we might have on automation or overconfidence because of previous experience. Even the experienced pilots are very subject to the awareness paradox as well, right? Because everything is contextually driven when we're making those risk assessments. For someone who maybe has flown into into the big white puffy cloud and has had a negative effect, that certainly is going to sit with them a little bit differently than someone who's encountered a big white puffy cloud a million times and yeah, I've done this before, I've got my automation, you know, we'll be fine, here's what we're going to do to engage with that without really fully understanding the implications or relying too heavily on, like I've said, automation. What happens if you're relying on that automation to help navigate you around the big white puffy cloud and now your automation quits?
Yep.
What is your level of situational awareness? What is your level of awareness of the energy management of that aircraft? Are you actually going to be able to navigate around it? So you can see kind of a trickle of compounding effects when something like the awareness paradox is at play, right? The next thing we're going to move on to is the trending trap.
Yeah, so in the trending trap, what we see from the traditional FRAT mechanism is this idea when we tie together certain risk factors like pop-up trip and twilight in this case, we arrive at a score of 5. And we begin to be conditioned to a particular response or action based on a numerical value. And again, so as we oversimplify this and we look at the numbers, we get used to seeing a particular score and interpreting it in a certain way. And so as I begin to look at score of 5, pop-up trip or twilight or hydraulic system work and so forth, those things, I equate that to a low risk operation. So that's my conditioned response and understanding of that numerical value. And so as time goes on, again, I see a 5, I see low risk, and I start to oversimplify. I start to have overconfidence of the issue, and I move on with my working day. But is it really low risk? Is a 5 really low risk? What if we have another factor like severe icing or an extended duty day and working alone for the ground folks? Is that a low risk operation? Certainly not, right? So in that case, by oversimplifying and only relying upon a singular value, we lead to a conclusion that's incorrect. And so again, the main point here is over-reliance on the numerical values prevents us from making a good aeronautical decision. And so we just wanted to point that out here to be aware of that, not to get stuck with the numbers, but really address what are the specific hazards that exist and how can I take concrete action to mitigate those things.
Yeah,
And facilitate a discussion, right, Madeline? So we should, if I do see severe icing, if I do see these other factors like long duty day or working alone, before I go do the work, I probably should have a discussion with my team members and mitigate the risk prior to entering that situation.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's something that is one of those pitfalls that we're not addressing specifically here, but I'll still mention it, which is not only what is a traditional risk assessment with numeric values not providing you, but what is it reinforcing? How it's not enforcing a discussion, right? Now, if you have a good habit of having a discussion about your pre-flight risk assessment or pre-work risk assessment, that's a different conversation. But it's still like look at the I'm going to actually go back to the first thing that we looked at here, right? When you're looking at a form, and this goes for any of these operations, right? Any of these types of operations, when you're looking at a form to look at to help you do a pre-flight pre-work risk assessment, it is preconditioning you to focus on those hazards that are already pre-identified for you. It is not helping you see beyond what's on that sheet. And so we tend to oversimplify our perspective on risk when we're just looking at kind of a pre-canned template of things that we know that we should be caring about. Sure, I'm not saying that that list is wrong, but it's incomplete because our work is so much more dynamic than that worksheet is ever really going to know. And so, yes, it's about having a discussion. And again, if you have good habits and you can use this to have a discussion, great, but it's also about what isn't on here that we need to care about. What lessons have been learned before me that I would need to be aware of? This sheet here is not helping me understand that information. And am I going to know to go back and look at a bulletin from 3 months ago that maybe had to do with something on here? Am I going to remember that information in this moment right now? Probably not, right? Because we have those cognitive limitations that we're referring to. We see the things that we want to see. There's the awareness paradox, right? So moving on from this, because I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, there's one final kind of component to a traditional risk assessment that we want to talk about. And this for me is one of the more profound points, and that is the empirical illusion. There is no fundamental unit of risk. I'll say that again. There is no fundamental unit for risk. Think of something like your oven temperature. Thanksgiving is coming up in the US, so I'm going to be doing a lot of baking, and I'm going to have to set my oven to probably a low 300 to cook my turkey, and then eventually I'm going to have to bump that up to maybe 450 to cook the potatoes and everything else, right? When I do that, I'm going to be adding 100 degrees to my temperature set for my oven. I can take 300 degrees and add 100 degrees, and now I've got 400 degrees. It's going to be hotter, okay? How about length? Okay, centimeters or inches? Where do you fall in the world in this debate? But let's just take one of those, right? And you add a little bit more to it, you're going to be able to, use those units to actually communicate something that you're trying to communicate, right? Increasing length, increasing temperature, for example. We don't have that same benefit with risk. of a fundamental unit. If we did, our conversation would be a lot simpler. It is why the risk matrices that you're familiar with of the likelihood and severity exist to help us try to somehow normalize that, but even still, they're widely subjective and open to interpretation by and large, no matter how good your definitions are. That said, it's better than not having anything, but the point really here that I'm trying to make is that there isn't a fundamental unit. So when we are talking about the trending trap, that's, that alludes to this other issue that regardless of the trending trap of what a 5 means to you and what a 5 means tomorrow, you can't add these numbers and expect that you're going to have an understanding of where your risks actually are and how to interact with them. So let's go ahead and move on to our modern approach to risk assessment. And for this example, it is flight specific, so bear with us, extract what you can for ground, but we have some more examples for ground at the end that we'll show you. So Sean, why don't you go ahead and start?
Great. So, we take some of the similar principles, right? And remember, I don't want to go back to what Madeline said earlier. The regulations, the guidance doesn't box us into only performing a risk assessment one way, right? Remember that the FRAT checklist, the MRAT checklist was derived as a thought by industry as something that could improve decision making. And so as we kind of rethink the process altogether, where we begin is we aggregate all that information that exists out there that pilots, technicians are supposed to be aware of. Their responsibility is to be aware of the regulations, the aircraft limitations, the ground limitations, company rules, and so forth. And so the very first step of this process is to really automate the process of collecting all of that guidance material, all those limitations into one place, and then moving on from that. Once we've identified that for a given scenario, we want to analyze different factors that could trigger based on the conditions that present themselves for the specific day. So you can see here, after we've aggregated the data, we then work on analyzing it. Are we fatigued? If I combine fatigue and an unfamiliar airfield at night in mountainous terrain, that might trigger a company limit. That might trigger an aircraft limitation that previously I would have potentially skipped and maybe not thought of. And so as some system does this, as technology does this analysis on your behalf, it can result in a reminder or an advisory of a hazard along with a specific action. In this case, when I'm fatigued, when I'm approaching an unfamiliar airport at night in mountainous terrain, I need to be aware that there's potential for a long landing here. And therefore, I'm going to take some specific action as defined by guidance that exists. And so we take all of that material that a pilot should already know, set it against a set of conditions, and come back to the individual with a very specific, concrete reminder and action. And so in this way, we can be proactive. And again, if somebody hasn't flown in a certain condition for a period of time or hasn't done a particular maintenance activity in 6 months, the system, the technology can serve as a reminder tool to prevent kind of our thought processes, our cognition is just, we can't remember everything, right? So we're using technology to assist your activities and make it more successful. And in this slide here, what we want to discuss is, typically at the point of, in the context of a flight, scheduling and dispatch office is doing a lot all at once, of course, and typically manually. But when we introduce technology, we start to provide the opportunity for risk mitigation or risk assessment to happen very early on in the process, well before a pilot ever gets to the airplane. The goal here is by introducing technology, we can mitigate short runaways, we can mitigate fatigue, we can mitigate all these different factors ever before the pilot accepts the trip. All right, and so this really is the goal. I would encourage everyone to incorporate other stakeholders in the flight department as we think about who has a say, who has input into mitigating risk, and it really is not just the individuals operating the aircraft, but everybody who touches the department has an opportunity to influence risk mitigation practices. And so there's a collaboration that should be happening. There's a discussion, as we mentioned at the beginning, there's a discussion, a collaboration that should be happening between the different employees and stakeholders working together to mitigate risk. So risk assessments are critical to safe operations. That's no doubt about that. Again, we already had said that many of you are already doing this without using a specific tool, but we're codifying it and we're improving your ability to perform by introducing the technology, though. We want to do all of this activity before you ever step to the jet, if you will, or jack the airplane up, right? We want this to all happen well beforehand. Everyone is well informed about the risks they're about to face. All right. And again, this is not the risk assessment we're talking about here. The modern approach is not just documenting things that you already know about. Again, we want to uncover and unpack a situation and identify hazards and threats that maybe we didn't consider before, right? And so that's what we want to begin to think about, is expanding on a set list of 20 or 30 things and really starting to uncover where the true risk lies.
So a critical component to this, right, of the risk discussion, and it references back to ICAO's definitions, or not their definitions, but in Appendix 2, what it actually says about risk management, if you recall, is that it should be a result of both proactive and reactive methods, right? And so what Sean is speaking to here is proactive in a sense, but what I'm about to speak to is a little bit of reactivity, right? How can we take things that we're already learning and make sure they get back into the system in a way that allows people to see those lessons learned at a time that is relevant to them at the appropriate time and in the appropriate fashion. And so that's where I'm going to go with this conversation, right? How can we develop risk controls from our SMS that end up in our risk assessment? That is going to help us start to not necessarily close a loop, because I don't believe that this system is really a closed loop system. I think it is very open. There are a lot of influences on it, but how can it help us bridge that gap and ensure some, continuous improvement, if you were to use SMS terms? So let's again continue on with the flight operation example for just a moment before we get to some maintenance ones. And let's take, for example, in light of those pitfalls that we just mentioned, the idea that one of the most beneficial practices for your organization in the pre-work risk assessment is the incorporation of those lessons learned. So in this example, let's say that there was a long landing and a near runway excursion that we identified from maybe FOQA data, maybe we identified it from a safety report, what have you. We have that now. So we have an awareness of what just occurred. Now we need to understand why, right? Why did it happen? And that's how SMS can help facilitate us through that evaluation of those internal factors and the external factors that were all at play through a sort of causal analysis. And in this scenario, right, we have lots of different factors, right? We have human, organizational, we have weather, we have the environment, we have ATC, right? So through causal analysis, perhaps in this case, we identify that fatigue was at play, that there was a gap in knowledge because the pilot hadn't been to that airport in at least a year. Maybe there was a procedural non-compliance, which is really just a way of saying there's a procedure defined and what we did didn't fit within that procedure. Does it mean that the pilot was wrong? No. Does it mean that, well, we don't know what it means, right? We should probably ask the crew about that, or the maintenance technician, etc. What were they experiencing at that point in time that led them to take the decisions that they did? Because had they had a different perspective, and with hindsight, they probably would have made a different decision, right? So the procedural non-compliance isn't necessarily there. We're not mentioning it to attribute blame, but maybe just to understand that, maybe the procedure's wrong, or maybe the procedure doesn't really fit the potential for this scenario to occur. I think that is something very valuable to think about as we continue through the rest of this this slide build here. So, all right, so knowledge, procedures, maybe the landing was at low illumination time of day at a mountainous terrain airport, right? So all of these things occurred at this time to result in a long landing and a potential near runway excursion, okay? So what are we gonna do about it? Well, we should probably design a few risk controls that we can derive from the lessons learned of this experience. What are those risk controls? Now, it is very common for us to have the reaction to educate crew or to change an operational policy or procedure or to disseminate a bulletin about the event in hopes that an awareness of all of these factors for this crew is going to somehow help a crew in the future. So let's just simplify that into modifying our operational manual, okay? Let's do that. Let's modify the operational manual. But as we've just talked about, we have a couple of challenges here. Is everyone going to read it? Does everybody know what their part is in what that change is? Do they know what it means to them? What does it mean to change something in a manual or to disseminate information if there's no context behind it? Why is this change coming about anyways? What led to it? What other factors are we considering? Or are we just being reactionary to a particular event that occurred? Because that's what we generally see, right? And now you have this voluminous, this monstrosity that is your operational manual and your training program. How effective is it really? So most importantly, at some point in the future, if this same exact situation were to occur, for example, is the next crew or is the next maintenance tech or is the next ground ops guy going to remember those changes or what occurred in training or what have you? Maybe if they were the ones who were involved previously, they'll have a better memory. But again, we're relying on knowledge assumption. We're relying on this assumption that through osmosis, we're able to communicate all of this information and that because we've communicated it once, people are aware, right? There are a lot of assumptions that are being made. Science has shown us that if you don't use it, you lose it. If you train something and you don't encounter something for a period of time, your ability to remember and to cope with it is going to be compromised naturally. That's largely in part why we have sim training, right? Or why we have recurrent training programs. But even still, how frequent is your training program? For maintenance as well, every 2 years, every year. There are a lot of components of an aircraft, right? And yes, there are a lot of methods that we can use, but I wonder, and the same is true for operational side as well, for flight operations, right? Just because you're training every 6 months, well, okay, but what happens at month 3 or month 4 of training? When you're so far removed from that profile that you just ran, assuming that the profile you ran even supports the conditions that you're encountering, right? So perhaps a more successful approach would be to introduce information at the right time when it's relevant or when it could be relevant so that the crew can have a discussion and make that conversation, or that the maintenance team or the ground ops team can make that conversation, right? So we can start to hopefully see a retention of knowledge with information being presented at the right time. Not really retention of knowledge, but an awareness of the right information at the right time. That's kind of the gist here. So modifying an operational manual, okay, but let's talk about introducing that information, right? Let's think about how we can create dynamic hazard awareness as a result of the scenario we just encountered. So yes, reactive, and codify those lessons learned in a pre-work setting or pre-work system that allows us to be aware of not necessarily those conditions happening at the same time, but what else does that allude to, right? So yes, maybe if fatigue or if there's a lack of knowledge operating at a particular airfield and low illumination and mountainous terrain, maybe we need to present a long landing advisory. That's excellent. But what else could this also provoke us to put in the system? And now we're getting into a more proactive sense, right? What if it's just a lack of familiarity with an airport and that airport is mountainous? Now we're just extracting 2 of those 4 components, and there's still something valuable there. It's not as reactive, actually. We're getting more into the proactive method of risk, of hazard identification at this point. And that might lead to other advisories that you would want to communicate at a point in time. And so this is just an example of something that you would see, for example, in our tools of advisories being presented to you because of what Sean was referring to earlier, right? All of these different pieces of sources of information that we have, time of day, schedule, what aircraft you're operating on, if you're a pilot, where are you flying to or from? What's the weather? What are your NOTAMs? What are your TFRs? Some of these things can still be very relevant to maintenance in the ground as well. So by taking all of those factors, that's really what we're assessing to present these advisories that we're talking about. So all in all, again, the right information to the right people at the right time to allow you to be more informed to make better decisions, as opposed to having a very narrow analytical perspective of a pre-identified list of hazards that may or may not encapsulate everything that you're going to be experiencing at any given time. So I want to move on to a couple of examples, and Sean, I'm going to jump around on you, and let's just maybe start with the maintenance example first.
Yeah, let's do that. So using the same process that we just actually saw, we have the collection of inputs on the left-hand side. Those are the things that we know we're responsible to know. We build this scenario. We then want to apply the scenario and all the guidelines and limits to using specific rules that we've developed based on company specs, aircraft specs, and so forth, resulting in specific advisories. So using the more modern approach that we've just talked about, we want to look at an example on the next slide here that will show us, okay, how to deal with a specific scenario. So this is a ground servicing or ground ops case, and the idea is that the example in this case here is a quick turn. So prior to the flight, we know we're expecting short leg, quick turn at the next stop, 15 minutes, and then we're out. All right, and so in the hustle and bustle of all that activity, we're picking up passengers, we're putting some fuel on the airplane, baggage is going. There's a flurry of activity hovering around the aircraft and equipment as well. The question is, have we thought about all of the hazards that exist? We realize that some passengers are starting to board the aircraft. Meanwhile, the FBO begins the fueling process, hooking things up. Airplanes trucked and so forth. And meanwhile, pilots going in to check the flight parameters, pay the bill, etc. But have they forgotten that the pilot is supposed to remain on board the airplane to facilitate an emergency evacuation, right? And so we found ourselves in a situation where had we not pre-briefed the quick turn, this very fast quick turn with a lot of people, a lot of bags, fueling, and all these different activities, this may have very well slipped our mind with everybody doing different things. And so the idea here is using technology, using a more advanced risk assessment model, can we alert the crew members or other people involved in this activity that, hey, the discussion should be, hey guys, we need to make sure somebody's on board the airplane to take care of the passengers, right? As simple as that. We're in compliance with company procedures now. We're protecting the safety of the aircraft and the individuals, and things will go more smoothly. So this also protects us from, being pressured, right? If it takes us 17 minutes to get off rather than 15, so be it, right? So this is just a very brief example of how compounding activities can result in us missing something critical and important where we really need to be doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, right, the main point here or another emphasis of this is that ground risk work assessment like this going to help you remember or have that awareness or even just an understanding of what that operation is actually requiring from you, because that's more the conversation that we need to be having, and that's where the real risk lies. Right? Not saying again that the things on here aren't important. It's just that it's very contextually driven. And so when we start to look at our modern risk approach by factoring in standards of our own company by factoring regulations and then also factoring in lessons learned and risk controls that are derived from our SMS. Now we're getting into a place of just, again, doing better work, doing better business, and the risk assessment is going to be inherent in that awareness and in that dialogue that hopefully will transpire with that awareness. So there are tools out there that can do that, obviously us being one of them, and we're happy to talk with you about that. Our final points here, just to wrap it up before we get to questions, is pre-work risk assessments are grounded in SMS risk management fundamentals, right? I think we've hit that point home pretty hard. Hazard identification and dialogue are very critical for a successful mission. And finally, does 1 + 1 = 2? In our perspective, no, not in this case. One hazard plus another hazard does not mean that we just have 2 hazards or that it's a weight of 2, right? What does that actually mean? What we care more about is the dialogue that needs to be held around the things that matter because of our own context at any given time. So hopefully that just helps you change your perspective a little bit on how you're managing risk pre-work, and where maybe you can fine-tune your mentality to ensure that you're not falling into some of these cognitive limitation traps that we know exist. With that, Catherine, I know we're very close on time, but if there are any questions, I think we can stick around for a minute or two.
We are, and no, great presentation. Thank you for that. And now we're on to the new math.
Yeah.
That's right. How we change our conceptions about that. Madeline, Sean, thank you so much. Here you can see some contact information for these guys, and we do have a couple of questions. The great presentations. First one, numbers-based FRAT have the tendency of not being revisited after initial assessment. Any recommendation on making sure they're not forgotten about?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm curious at what point in the conversation that question was posed, because hopefully, you know, we've entered a different discussion of why we should be moving away from those traditional frats. I think the recommendation that I have is to include the pre-flight risk assessment in your post-work debriefing. I think that should be done, period, regardless of what assessment tool you have. And really the question that we should be asking, and I'll credit my my former professor, Ivan Popoliti, on this, of what really surprised us. And when you start asking that question in a post-work debrief, and you ask that question and you use maybe your traditional FRAT as a reference, you'll start to uncover very naturally elements of hazards and a lack of risk assessment that were not being accounted for on that FRAT. Right. So, and the same thing is also true for the type of assessment that we promote, right? Where it's more advisory based for you to have that discussion. It's the same thing. What surprised us? What information was not on my pre-work briefing that would have or could have been useful to me at that time? That is going to kind of help you understand maybe where the dialogue was lacking, or what information might have been lacking from that pre-work risk assessment, and also help you fine tune it for the future. So it should constantly evolve. Hopefully that helps answer that question.
All right, thank you so much. Let's see. So, how do you incorporate company requirements into the risk assessment? That would require a good amount of time to develop, and the risk of missing important items. How can that be automated as you propose?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing is that I recommend, and then I'll pass this over to Sean, is to take a look at your own company manuals and just be very critical of it, right? Have a critical eye. What information in here? Not everything is going to need to go into, for example, our tool. Definitely some things should. And yes, there is a time-consuming component to this. It's always going to be that way anytime you're fine-tuning a system, whether it be ours or something else, right? But once you get over that initial hump of getting the kind of the core of any SOPs into the system, hopefully your SOPs aren't changing that drastically where it needs so much attention and modification over time. The hope is that you can set those and just slowly fine tune them over time. So yes, the recommendation for getting those into the system, particularly if you're using our tool, is really maybe just to reach out to that service provider and see what services they have available, because I'm going to bet that there are services available to help companies with that work. Because yes, it is labor intensive, particularly for the smaller organizations that have part-time safety guys who are flying the line and doing other things. So yeah, we recognize that the issue is there. We have our own solutions to solve that. So again, hopefully that helps. But Sean, any more to add on that?
Yeah, I would say, in a practical example, give a few practical examples here, what I would be looking for, things like crew duty limitations within the manual, special procedures. Airports is a huge one people forget about, right? We're not flying to those off the way places all the time, and our manual has guidance about it. So incorporate those in this pre-work risk assessment process as a way of reminding folks when they do have that trip pop up, how to deal with the situation, which, it doesn't even have to be safety related, to be honest. You could just procedural and reminder information. Well, what handler are we supposed to use? Is there a time of day issue here? All these different aspects that we might have covered in these kinds of references in our manual we want to capture. Other examples would be, aircraft limitations. Do you have runway limits for a certain aircraft type and not another? Do you have time of day limits and so forth? So all these different practical cases that you really wouldn't find on a typical FRET checklist, we want to start to incorporate those, and they serve as excellent reminders of how to handle specific scenarios.
Yeah, and you're alluding to a great point as well, which is, again, size and scope and complexity of your operation, and start where you can start. Take a step, right? And I would also recommend, we've seen this be super helpful, just in general, is involving other people in your flight department. Just because you might be in the position of managing the program doesn't mean you're the only one that needs to be involved in the program. And so if you can have many hands making light of a lot of work, I think that would benefit you as well, at least in making the determination of prioritization of things to get into the manual. It can evolve, or to get into the system, it can evolve with time, right? You can iterate on it. Not everything needs to be in there from day one as you start to get familiar with whatever tool you use.
Great suggestions. Here's another one with an organization that started using a FRET several years ago, and it's feeling a bit stale. Do you have any suggestions or best practices for them to ask the right questions while they're doing the risk assessment, and or to keep it fresh?
Yeah, I'll take that one, Madeline. I think what I typically see, successful risk assessments, with operators doing this methodology, is incorporating the lessons learned, right? So, and Madeline hit on it a number of times in the presentation here, but as you learn things in your daily life, whether you're a technician or a pilot or dispatcher, that knowledge should be captured formally somewhere. And we really need to bring that knowledge forward into these pre-work risk assessments to keep it from being stale, fresh, and something that's relevant for people looking at it. So that's what I would really focus on, those lessons that you're learning through your daily life.
I think that's excellent, Sean. And just one more question that I would add on to that as well is, where could we be surprised today, right? So take that post-work debrief question of where were we surprised, and turn it into that hypothetical, where could we be surprised today? It's just going to provoke you to think a little bit differently about the work that you're about to do, regardless of if you're using a traditional assessment tool or, for example, one of ours, right? That's a little bit more modern to the approach. It's going to insinuate that yes, we might be nearing a state of complacency or a place of staleness that is making something less interesting and encouraging our behavior to maybe steer away from actually having the conversation that we need to be having, right? We're humans, that's naturally going to happen. So how can you, shake it up? I think, in addition to those lessons learned, hey, what have we learned recently? What have we seen happen with this event in the past? How can we incorporate that into today's learnings? And also, where could we be surprised today? I would add that in.
Great.
All right, so we've got new math and a great question to ask just anytime. What's going to surprise us today? What's happened before and what could? In terms of lessons learned and sharing information, is there any sort of place where there's some sharing about learning and using risk assessments or improving upon them that you guys know of?
Yeah, so at least for us, we have a community that's available to help with that, and of course, educational, videos and articles and things like that. We also have a community of shared rules, so lessons that are being learned by other companies that they deem as maybe something someone else can learn from that you can go in and interact with. I think generally on the international scale, that is something that is, I shouldn't say lacking, but I should say is still kind of in this mindset of something that we're trying to debunk right now, which is that traditional flight risk assessment tool. So I think I've already driven that point home hard enough. So really what I'll say on that is there are resources available. NBAA actually has several references. I think if you just Google NBAA in the United States and flight risk assessment tools, they've got a whole series of links and things that they can guide you to, and I think some videos on there as well. That can be helpful. The FAA as well has a little bit of that too. Of course, like I said, we have our own. But what I would say about that is just don't go into those resources assuming that you're going to figure out the right way to do a risk assessment. Have a little bit of skepticalness, be a little bit critical maybe of those things, and remember where you're at, right? So it's good to have long-term goals of where you want to be, of who you might want to idolize in terms of an organization that's doing something really well that you might see a video on or something like that. But how are you going to get there? Where are you at now, and what step can you take? So I threw kind of a couple things out there, but yes, resources are available. If you want to reach out to me personally through that info, I can provide you some specific references, and maybe we can have a different dialogue.
Yeah, I'd also add, by the way, Madeline, just industry itself, I think has a lot of great resources as far as regional safety committees, which are, fantastic resource for just collaboration on these kinds of things. And don't forget also, FAA has been actively putting out things like arrival alert notices and being really creative with identifying hazards out there in the national airspace system and informing users about that. And so keep yourselves informed about that. Keep yourselves informed on what I see people forgetting a lot, your letters to airmen that are in the NOTAMs. These are notices from ATC. I think there's probably a good over 1,000 of them in the NOTAMs database right now, and they're kind of getting forgotten about. Great description of hazards from the ATC community and ways to mitigate that directed to the flight crew. So take advantage of some of those industry resources that are out there.
That's awesome. Thank you, Sean. Thank you, Madeline. This has been an excellent presentation as always. Thank you to all of you for attending today. I'd like to note that this presentation has been recorded and it will be available on the IBAC website. Just go to the webinars drop down and you'll see it there. The Polaris Aero folks are going to be giving us one more in the fall series in December, so I hope to see you all there. In the meantime, stay safe, stay interested. Look for what's being surprised, and don't forget about new math as we go through this. And Madeline and Sean are available through the contact information you saw on the slide. So I hope we see you all soon. Thank you all very much, and have a great holiday season.
All right, thanks everyone.
Bye-bye.